Okay. Thank you everyone for waiting. We will be now getting underway. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the many lands on which we meet. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australia and global society. My name is Daniel Ortiz Barriento. I'm a professor here in the School of the Environment at the University of Queensland, and I'm chief investigator at the ARC Center of Excellence in Plant Success. And I'm excited to introduce today Professor Peter Reich, who is here visiting us. So Peter is the director of the Institute for Global Change Biology at the University of Michigan, and he has helped pioneer the development and upscaling of trait-based ecology, and is a world leader in running state-of-the-art ecosystem scale, climate change, and biodiversity experiment. And as we've been talking just before, I mean, like discussing the value of these long-term visions and long-term experiments that bring many people together, which is the only way in which we can make a difference. Peter also, as you know, has helped launch the science education channel, Minute Earth, and who has been visited over 750 million times now. Peter, of course, worries incessantly about the state of people and nature on our planet. And yes, despite so much evidence of our collective failures, he's an optimist about our shared future. And I hope we all maintain like that and learn from him. So thank you for being here, Peter, and please join me in welcoming him.
Thanks for the introduction. And can everyone hear me online and in the room? Great. I'll just share my screen. Is there yet? No. Yeah, it is now. Okay, great. Let me get rid of the junk on my screen so I can see my. Whoops. That. Oh, it's still there. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to share with you today my personal journey across scales, disciplines, and domains over several decades, from plant traits to biodiversity ecosystem function to climate mitigation and justice. But hopefully it's more than just my own experience, but it will tell us a little bit about the way in which, as scientists, perhaps we can cross disciplinary barriers within science or even beyond science. And so hopefully it won't just be about me. And I should mention I have joint appointments at the University of Michigan, but also the University of Minnesota, and still have a shared appointment at Western Sydney University. So I've been lucky to be engaged with folks at several institutions over a long time period. And I also want to start by thanking all of the people who have made some of the work you find today possible. So students, undergrads, grad students, postdocs, colleagues, and they should get the credit for anything you hear today that you like, and you can blame me for anything you don't like or disagree with. So I use this cartoon to try to frame the work I do within a larger context. So pretty much everything you'll hear today fits somewhere in this scenario where I'm interested in the way in which climate might influence biodiversity and ecosystem function, the way in which biodiversity might influence ecosystem function, and the way in which all of these are driven by what we do as societies, and in turn, what the feedbacks are to societies. Now, you can't study, or it's not easy to study all of these arrows simultaneously. So in particular examples over the next 50 minutes, I'll touch upon one or two at a time usually. And so the outline is, first I'll start with a bit of framing and perspective, and then the three main sections. One is on plant traits, biodiversity, and ecosystem function. Then I'll pivot a little bit and say, well, now that we have some idea of how we might think about that, what does that mean for the way in which the world is changing through global climate change and other global changes, and what are the implications for ecosystem health and for the ability to use natural climate solutions to help slow down climate change. And then last, pivot again, but more briefly, to more recent work in which I try to take what we do on the land and think about it within the greater context of other aspects of society, other aspects of decarbonization and social justice. So why is this kind of work worthwhile? Well, as everyone in this room knows, the Earth has warmed by more than 1 degree C now since 1900. And by 2020, which is now in the rearview mirror, almost every biome and its people are already struggling from climate change. And by 2060, climate change will reduce global human well-being every year by as much as the worst years on record, such as World War II and the Great Depression. And this is not just me, some wild-eyed ecologist saying this. This is Swiss Re, which is the world's largest reinsurance company. Their business is insuring all the other insurance companies. So if anyone has to understand risk, it's them. And this is a direct or accurate summarization of some of their statements. Well, the world has already warmed 1 degree C, and we're in trouble because of that. Without oceanic and land sinks, the Earth would have already warmed by 2 to 2.5 degrees C. So a really big question is whether this multi-quadrillion-dollar service can persist and whether we can enhance it with things such as natural climate solutions. Or will we actually lose the sink strength due to damages from climate change to our ecosystems? So here's a simple version of the global carbon cycle from the Global Carbon Project. Of the 100% of the emissions we put in the air each year, 90% of which are from fossil fuel burning and about 10% or 11% from net land use change, over the last decade and many decades now, only 45% of that has stayed in the atmosphere each year, whereas 55% it has been scrubbed out and stored in the oceans or the terrestrial ecosystems. So one question about natural climate solutions is, can we somehow enhance those sinks? In this example, if we can store another 15%, if only 30% of what we put in the atmosphere stays there each year, we're at least slowing down the rate of carbon accumulation and the rate of climate change. So that's, in a big picture framework, one way I like to think about natural climate solutions. But I also think about this from something I call the 1% rule. And this has to do with the amount of carbon stored in plants and soils and in the air, and the exchange between those. So there's 4 times as much carbon in plants and soils as is stored in the atmosphere. And there's a very dynamic interplay. 1 in every 7 CO2 molecules is photosynthesized each year. So there's a pretty dynamic flow between atmosphere and biosphere. But there's also 300 times as much carbon in soils and plants as are emitted each year by humans. So all it would take, quote unquote, is a 1% increase in global productivity, or GPP, and a 1% decrease in carbon losses from soil respiration and wildfire to offset 1/5 of our annual emissions. Now, raise your hand if anyone in this room has ever measured anything in the field or even the lab with enough precision to detect a 1% effect. Certainly I haven't. If we're within 15%, maybe we're lucky. So what we're talking about here is a tiny proportional change that's really important, but it has to happen in every single kind of ecosystem all over the planet for it to work. And so that's the challenge we face in thinking about natural climate solutions through changing at least this one aspect of climate change interaction, the carbon cycle. So with that as the background, I'm going to go to the first part of my major part of my talk, involving plant traits, biodiversity, and ecosystem function. And I backtrack to this because when I started doing research, thinking about individual ecosystems, let's say a forest in Wisconsin or a soybean field in upstate New York, I wasn't equipped to think like, how would you scale from that to the region or the continent or the globe? Because of the amazing diversity of ecosystems we have on the planet, and amazing diversity of climate. So when you look at this kind of picture, you could substitute 17 other slides with 9 photos of different parts of the world. They're all uniquely different and in many cases very beautiful. And within each of them, you have a variety of plant types, including different kinds of leaf forms and function. So given all this diversity, how do we make any sense of it? So decades back now, I was one of probably several dozen people around the world who really started to think about, is there an alternative to species-based approach? Or do we need to study every species in every single backyard of every single person on the planet in order to come to some generalization? And so I think about trait-based ecology as asking whether the structure and function of communities and ecosystems emerges from the functional properties of organisms in a way that you can have a common currency in different systems where you don't even think about the names of the species. So the example here is, you can think of a white spruce from Canada, or kingbilly pine from Tasmania, a picture I took a couple of weeks ago now, growing in completely different ecosystems, different climates, different evolutionary histories. They both have foliage that lasts for several years. That foliage has generally low nutrient concentrations and slow metabolic rates compared to other species. Do those commonalities tell you anything about their ecology, about how they fit into their ecosystem, how they compete, how they might influence ecosystem properties in these very different systems? And if there is, then we maybe have a currency where we don't have to know every single species, the 400 species in this 1 hectare of Amazonian forest and the other 200 in the next hectare over, but by knowing something about their traits, we can say something about these systems. So some of the concepts in theory that many of us have worked on over several decades is asking whether this approach has any value. And I'm going to talk about 4 different ideas here, which fit into, the first 2 really fit into individuals and communities, and the second 2 into communities and ecosystems. The first is whether economic trade-offs, things such as growth versus survival or slow versus fast traits, structure ecology in any meaningful way. Or you can think about constraints that aren't necessarily trade-offs per se, but things like ecological stoichiometry, like literally the ratios of carbon to nutrients in cell walls and in other kinds of tissues. And then you can scale up to the community ecosystem and ask whether the mean value of traits for a community tell you anything about its function, or whether independent of that average value, the diversity or the heterogeneity of traits tell you anything about that function, which to me is actually the underlying root of why biodiversity ecosystem function relationships might actually exist. So I can think about functional trait variation, which is shown here in the middle of the screen here, and think about how it's driven by selection and environmental variation and the consequences it might have for communities and ecosystems. So the first of the concepts or theories I'm going to talk about is this whole idea of trait trade-offs. And we used originally leaves as a test bed for this theory. You could use individual plants, you could use microbes, you could use animals of any kind. And some of the ideas we tested were this notion of a fast versus slow strategy, which I'll unpack in a minute, and whether these actually hold across n-dimensional trade-off envelopes rather than just bidirectional dimensional envelopes, and whether these hold within and among communities. So here the example I give is a productivity versus persistence trade-off, that the tortoises of the world aren't very productive, they're not very fast, they're not very good at acquiring resources, but maybe they're persistent, whereas maybe organisms such as hares that can be very productive but aren't very persistent. And here we're using these in a very, very stereotypical cartoon fashion. And so if this is true, maybe you can have viable fitness along a trade-off envelope like shown in the gray, but that you can't be successful off of that trade-off envelope. And if you're in the bottom left there, maybe you could engineer a leaf that's neither productive nor persistent, but it's not going to be very successful. On the other hand, it may be biophysically impossible to have a leaf that's very productive and very persistent because you can't allocate the same materials to productivity and to defense necessarily. And so if this is true, it may be that not all trait combinations exist in nature and that the constraints and trade-offs allow us to structure how we think about these. So my first foray into that I'm going to share today is we studied 100 species at 6 sites from the tropics to the tundra and across the Americas. And we also gathered data for 100 species from the literature. And in this case, we're looking at 3 traits in combination: photosynthetic capacity, specific leaf area, or how thick a leaf is, and leaf nitrogen concentration. And you can see that all the data pretty much fall on a plane, which goes from the ones that have high photosynthetic capacity and high nutrient concentrations and high specific leaf area to the opposite. And you might ask, well, why aren't all the species like the hares? Why doesn't everything have high photosynthesis? And it's because there's no free lunch, and there are high costs to having leaves that have high photosynthetic capacity. You use a lot of water, you have high respiratory carbon costs, you have high nutrient acquisition costs, and also you have high replacement costs because leaves that have high photosynthetic rates don't live very long and you have to replace them. So these things all go hand in hand. So fast forward another decade, I teamed up with Mark Westerby and Ian Wright from Macquarie University to expand this from 6 sites to 175 sites around the world, working with collaborators from 40 different labs around the world. And we started using the word leaf economic spectrum to describe this. And we basically found exactly the same thing, that in all 175 sites, there were trade-offs between these different leaf traits, and basically the trade-offs followed pretty much the same quantitative rules. And they followed those rules within and among sites. Fast forward another decade, and several dozen of us teamed up with Jens Kotka in the upper left and Sandra Diaz in the upper right to develop the TRI-database, which tries to put together, no pun intended, data, all kinds of functional traits around the world into a shared database. How many of you have ever downloaded data from or uploaded data to the TRI-database? A quarter, a third of people in this room. How about Oztraits? About the same fraction, which is the Australian version. And so this has been an amazing, there's probably hundreds, if not thousands of papers now that have used these data. There's more than 15 million records from 300,000 taxa. And I think it was an example of the way in which globally scientists are starting to put data together and making them available and accessible to each other around the world, which I think is a really wonderful thing. And democratizing in many ways, although, and we could talk about this at lunch, it also means that there's a little incentive for anyone to ever go out and get their own data, if everyone else can have your data immediately, as our government has required in the past. So I'm going to show one piece of data from, or one slide about the TRI-database from Sandra Diaz and 80 of us, 2016 Nature paper, where if you look at the Whitaker space on the left, you can see that pretty much most of the climate space on the planet is filled with the 2,200 species for which we have these 6 traits, although on the right, you can see that it's not uniformly across the world's geography. But the one point I want to make here is that if you look at 6-dimensional trait hypervolume, which is hard to show in 2 dimensions on the screen here, 98% of possible combinations don't exist in nature. So to me, this is really important, is that these trait correlations and trait trade-offs actually structure trait space. Only 2% of possible combinations are found in nature. And so if you look on the bottom left there, when you look in 6 dimensions rather than 2, there really is a fitness envelope in multidimensional space in which plants can operate. Now, you don't have to be at any one point on that envelope. You can be in many places to be successful, but you can't be outside of that envelope, or you won't be successful in an evolutionary or a phenotypic sense. So a quick history, in some sense, of plant trait science, focusing on the plant traits themselves. But now I'm going to segue into, like, does this really matter for anything else we care about in ecology? So does this fast versus slow trade-off, fast plants that grow fast but don't survive for a long time versus those that have slower rates of growth and resource acquisition, does this explain long-term forest dynamics or dynamics in grasslands or other systems? And is it true within and among communities? I'm going to give 2 examples here. The first is work led by Joe Reich from the famous BCI 50-hectare mapped plot in Panama, where he gathered data from more than 100 species, more than 360,000 individuals censused over about a 25-year period. And then he engineered the collection of trait data, a small number of traits for the 100 species. And he wanted to see whether this would explain the long-term forest dynamics, and invited Ian Wright and me and some others to work with him on this data and this analysis. And so what we found was that at the scale of the individual, there is a trade-off between growth rate and mortality, and especially when they're in the sapling state, where the species that have high growth rates as saplings had very low survival over a 5-year period. And at the other extreme, those that have low growth rates tend to have high survival. So there's a trade-off between growth and survival. And when we look at the traits, 2 traits of the 4 we measured explained 40% of all variance in growth and mortality. These 2 traits were wood density and leaf tissue density, or leaf mass per area. So basically, the species that have high tissue density also tend to have low respiration costs, which is useful if you're growing in deep shade, long leaf lifespan, which is also useful in deep shade, and low growth and mortality rates, the tortoises. And so you have this trade-off where species arrayed along this growth and survival gradient also varied in wood and leaf tissue density. Now, when Joe first was analyzing the data, he turned to Ian, and Joe and Ian are not related other than they're both great scientists. And Joe said to Ian and me, hey, you guys have been telling me how great traits are, it only explains 40% of our data. Like, that's not very satisfying. Where Ian and I had the exact opposite response, like, wow, 2 traits that you can measure once on an individual of a species. They're not even the traits we would most prefer to have. I'd much rather have leaf dark respiration rate than wood density or leaf tissue density. And yet you can explain 40% of what happened for 360,000 individuals over 23 years. That's amazing. And so we in the end agreed that maybe the glass is half full, and I think to me, this is a way to think about traits in general. They're never going to explain everything unless you measure every single thing and call it a trait. But that thinking about a few key attributes of a system might help you get partway down the path to understanding how the system works. Maybe 20% of the way down the path, maybe 40%, maybe 60%, depending on the system and the question. But that it's a way to start structuring your thinking. And then you can ask, hey, what else is going on that the traits don't explain? Or what traits are we not measuring that maybe explain more? And can move on from there. Now, the other example I want to talk about, I only learned about yesterday. And even though I try to keep up with the literature is vast and you can't read everything, but John Dwyer and I were chatting yesterday, and he mentioned this great paper from Ecology Letters a year ago, where they have data for 285 species across a 600 to 2,500 millimeter rainfall gradient, which is 45 sites or something like that. And so the Joe Wright study at BCI showed over many individuals and many species at one site within a community over a long time period that traits helped explain things. Here, John was able to show that traits having to do with hydraulic strategy were strongly related to where in this dry to wet gradient the species tended to occur most frequently. And so basically the species that showed up most frequently in the dry end, if you look on the y-axis, the lower values are the dry end of this rainfall gradient. They tend to have small vessels, which are associated with low maximum capacity to transpire or photosynthesize and low growth rates, but are less vulnerable to cavitation, and high wood density, which also is associated with drought tolerance. And the other extreme, those in the wet area have large vessels, can move a lot of water, which helps associated with being able to grow fast and have low wood density. And so the traits seem to be associated both within sites and across sites. Well, I'm going to move on from thinking about community ecology to thinking about what I think of as ecosystem ecology. And instead of thinking about the value of traits for individual species, I'm going to think about what do traits mean for the entire community. And here I'm going to lump together ecological stoichiometry and community-weighted mean traits, which by definition are abundance-weighted traits rather than the average of all the species. You average of all the species traits by their relative abundance. And the context I'm going to ask has to do with elevated CO2 and whether nitrogen or phosphorus-limited ecosystems are going to increase productivity under rising CO2 or have already. And this is important because Earth system models predict that there's large carbon sinks in places like the tropics. And if that's not true, we're in more trouble than we think. And it also matters even more so because the sink strength really depends on the answer to this question. So in work that we've done in Cedar Creek, Minnesota, with a long-term grassland experiment and prior free air CO2 enrichment experiments with young trees in North America and in other systems in Europe, we saw that CO2 fertilization effects are lower under low nitrogen, so that when soils are limited in nitrogen, we see a smaller effect. In our experiment, the fertilization effect, meaning how much greater the productivity is under elevated CO2, it's only half as large under the ambient nitrogen. When we add 4 grams N per meter squared per year, we get twice as large a fertilization effect. And we've seen this consistently over, well, actually, we didn't see it the first 3 years, which is another reason why long-term experiments matter, but we saw it after 6 years and every year since. So that's for nitrogen. What about in the tropics where so many systems are limited by phosphorus? So here I'm showing the Uke-Face experiment in Australia. How many of you have visited Hawkesbury and seen this experiment? If you ever get a chance, if you're ever in the Sydney area, you should go take a look at it. It's mind-boggling to see it up close. And I'm very glad that unlike our experiment in Minnesota, we didn't get to build this by ourselves because probably wouldn't be safe. Dave Ellsworth and Belinda Medlin shown there have been the leaders of this experiment. And basically the whole question here is whether relative nutrient limitations or the lack of phosphorus in this low phosphorus system, with low phosphorus concentrations and high leaf N/P concentrations, whether this would impact the CO2 fertilization. We actually know from adding phosphorus just outside the plots that the trees grow faster when you add phosphorus, so they are phosphorus limited. And our idea was like from the global north, well, maybe the CO2 response of increased growth will be smaller than we see in the rest of the world, but it should be there. Well, we were wrong because there was actually no response at all of growth. Photosynthesis increases by about 15%, but all that extra carbon goes below ground and comes right back out as soil CO2 flux without the plants growing any larger. This shows the data from the first 3 years from a paper that Dave led almost a decade ago now, above ground NPP, the ambient in the left of each pair of bars. There's no evidence that the elevated CO2 plots have higher growth in response to elevated CO2. And then we see the same thing by 2020 or 2024, and a couple of other papers led by Mingkai Jiang, where we actually looked at the entire carbon cycle and then eventually the entire phosphorus cycle to understand the way in which microbes are outcompeting plants for any of the phosphorus, and that's why the CO2 response is so small. And the big question is, does this one experiment mean that the world's rainforests, most of which are phosphorus limited, shown in green here, have low carbon sink strength? We have no idea, because you could try to extrapolate from one experiment to the world. It's better than no experiments, but we really don't know, and you really need 10 or 20 such experiments to come to some meaningful conclusion. My hunch is that in most of these systems, you would get a positive response, but it might be smaller than if you had really rich soils. And that maybe very few of them should have as small a response or no response as a nuke face, but that's just a guess. Now, we do know from 138 elevated CO2 experiments, most of which are not free air CO2 enrichment experiments, that we do see that systems that are phosphorus or nitrogen limited are broadly associated with smaller ecosystem responses to rising CO2. Cesar Terrer led a bunch of us on a paper summarizing this a number of years ago. So the UKFACE experiment and the Biocon experiment are consistent with most of the other experiments out there. So moving on from thinking about the average traits of a system and what they might mean for the ecosystem, what about the diversity of traits? Even if you have exactly the same canopy nitrogen concentration and exactly the same specific leaf area, does higher diversity of traits in a system matter? And if so, is this really at the root of the whole notion of biodiversity ecosystem function? So when we think about mechanisms of biodiversity effects on ecosystem function, here, and I'm really talking about over-yielding, and here I'm talking about not species extinctions at a grand scale per se, but really what I think of as the simplification of ecosystems, like a grassland the size of this room, or a forest a hectare in size, that might have fewer species because of human interactions or human disturbance or climate change than they would otherwise have, and whether that lesser diversity within a patch, at which location species interactions matter the most, whether that changes the productivity and resilience of the system. And there's quite a few hypotheses about how diversity matters to ecosystem function. And by over-yielding, it literally means if you compared a forest with 3 species mixed together, is that productivity higher than the average of the 3 species if they were in monoculture? So there's things such as niche complementarity, that different species have ability to acquire resources at different times and places, whether it's deep-rooted versus shallow-rooted, hot times of year versus cool times of year, or 1,000 other ways they might differ, whether that together allows them to collectively acquire and hold on to resources more than they would alone. There's also things like facilitation, in which one species might protect another from stress, often highlight and heat is one such stress. There's also density-dependent escape from disease and pests, which there's lots of evidence that when a species is at high abundance and high density in any given landscape, it's going to be more prone to be eaten or infected by pathogens. Then you have plant-soil feedbacks in a plant system where maybe over time, higher diversity of plants leads to higher diversity of soil microbes, which increases soil fertility and feeds back to influence the system. And there's many other hypotheses. Now, these hypotheses grew out of abstract thinking, and we often wave our hands and say we found them in experiments, but they're actually very hard to test. I'm going to give a couple of examples of diversity effects from our studies. At the Cedar Creek, the site where I mentioned the biocon experiment, there's also 4 levels of species richness planted 27 years ago in that experiment. And a year before that, we started the so-called Big Bio experiment that Dave Tillman led, shown in the upper right there, on the same few hundred meters apart at Cedar Creek. And what we've looked at in this experiment over time is the fact that there are diversity effects on productivity, and that these effects have persisted over decades. But not only have they persisted, they've gotten larger and larger over time, which we did not anticipate. The yellow line shows, like, the yellow lines are the 2000s in the first few years of the experiment. And as you get to the green and the blue, that's early 2000s, the 2000 teens up to the 2020s. And you can see that the diversity effect going from 1 to 16 planted species on biomass gotten larger and larger over time, now for 27 years. And the reason this occurs is that some of these mechanisms take time to play out, in particular, plant-soil feedbacks. So what we've seen is that over time, the plots that are planted with and contain greater numbers of species tend over time to have a more microbially species-rich soils, and that increases nutrient cycling rates that feed back to allow the plants to grow collectively faster over time. So diversity matters, and it seems to matter more and more the longer and longer you run the experiment. And actually, we've had a couple of syntheses and meta-analysis in the last couple of years with dozens of grassland and forest experiments that show that this is true in many different experiments. In these experiments at Cedar Creek, we also see that not only does plant biomass increase with diversity and over time, but the soil carbon stocks are also higher, a third higher almost in diverse mixtures, which will come back to be relevant when we think about natural climate solutions in a bit. And soil diversity matters also. In a completely different set of studies, worked with Manu Delgado Bacarizo and Raj Singh from at that time, the Hawkesbury Institute, looking at an experiment we ran, but also observational studies around the world. We see that various kinds of soil diversity, or a multi-diversity index shown in black, and all kinds of ecosystem functions shown on the right there, or a multifunctionality index of all of them shown here on the y-axis, are related to biodiversity. So that whether you're talking about a narrow or broad aspect of soil biodiversity, more soil biodiversity is associated with a greater ecosystem function. So soil diversity matters independent of plant diversity, but the two feed on each other. So talked a bit about traits, about trait trade-offs, how they might be related to community assembly that allows species to coexist. That coexistence of species with different traits might make those ecosystems more productive and functional. So those are mostly in experiments or observational studies within constrained contexts. You know, when we think about global environmental change, climate change, ecosystem health, and natural climate solutions, does any of this matter? How do we use it to think about these? So we get back to this question about whether this multi-quadrillion-dollar service can persist and whether we can enhance it. So the three things I'm going to talk about here are climate change impacts on ecosystems, biodiversity loss impacts, and then what that might mean for natural climate solutions. Now, with climate change, you know, obviously Australia is a continent where fire has always been really important. Climate change is probably more important. This is not unique to Australia. Probably every country in the world is having more fires, more frequent fires, more intense fires because of it. Canada in 2023 had the year where they had the greatest fires ever. They didn't just increase like 50% or 80%. It was 500% higher than the previous record year. So like off the charts amount. And the red dots in the September 5th map there show all the places that forest fires were happening in that single day. And this is a cool, wet part of the world. So I think wildfire is going to be an enormous component of how global environmental change influences the world's systems. But for the rest of my talk today, I'm actually going to ignore fire And because even without fire, even ignoring wildfires, and even in a cold, wet environment like the boreal forest, climate warming already harms forests. I'm going to give a couple of examples here. One starting with a fine-scale experiment. We've been running a warming experiment, open air, soil and above ground warming of 1.5 or 3 degrees C for 15 years now in a climate change experiment, 2 locations in Minnesota, one near Duluth, which probably means nothing to most of you, and the other at near the Canadian border. And speaking of Canada, those of us in Minnesota, we're really hoping that Canada will invite us to be the 13th province or territory. You know, just move this border down here. That's Canada above there, for reasons that I don't need to go into. So what we've seen in this experiment is that even in this cool, wet kind of system, even modest warming can create tipping points. We studied more than 20 species and had a number of cohorts with 10,000 seedlings planted into natural systems, but I'm just going to show data for 2 of the dominant boreal conifers, balsam fir and white spruce. Just look at where the red arrows are, which is ambient rain treatment, going from the gray to the blue to the red shows ambient to +1.5 to +3.1 degree warming. And we see over a 5-year period here, poor regeneration of these conifers, both in terms of the growth rate and survival rate as you go from ambient to 1.5 to 3 degrees warming. And these responses are not trivially small. I mean, your survival goes from near 60% down to 30%, going just 1.5 degrees warming for balsam fir. And I won't go into all the details, but these are not related to like being too warm on any given day. It's basically because warmer plants transpire more and the soils evaporate more water, and the soil drying actually is what negatively impacts these species' regeneration survival. So you could say, well, this is just an experiment. You know, it's a big experiment. It's only 5 years, one spot. How does it relate to what's happening more broadly? Well, I'll give 2 examples. Our experiment is consistent with inventory observations across all of Canadian boreal forests. And these are a decade old now, but I'm sure that the data are probably even worse than that when they come up with the next paper on this. On the left, you see the biomass change in tons per hectare per year across all of Canada going down. And on the right, you can see that mortality for the dominant species and all the other species lumped has gone up considerably from 1960 to 2010 or so. So what we see in our fine-scale experiment matches what we see from the inventory of observations where they speculated that it was related to drought, but everything else is changing over time, so it's hard to tease one thing apart from the other. The other example I want to give from across Canada is a study I was involved in, led by Danny Way, who's now at the Australian National University. She was at University of Western Ontario when she started this. Paper led by Ariane Mirabel, that was in Nature Communication a couple of years ago now, where we had tree ring data from across Canada, and this showed that drying air and drying soils independently each reduce tree growth pretty much everywhere. So the way to look at these 2 figures, the left is black spruce, the right is white spruce. Anywhere that they're shown in red is a place where dry air the previous summer is associated with lower growth rate. Anywhere that there's blue, there's a couple little patches, is where dry air is associated with a higher growth rate. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that both of these spruces are negatively influenced by dry air almost everywhere. Now, this is standardizing for soil moisture. This is already accounting for dry soil effects. And so the sensitivity to dry air is something that probably occurs everywhere on the planet. And there's actually a very simple, straightforward physiological answer. Almost every non-chem plant on the planet tends to close its stomates when the vapor pressure deficit gets higher when the air is drier. And if you close your stomates, all else being equal, you're going to photosynthesize less and grow less. So this might be happening globally. And actually, my initial training was a plant physiologist, I think ecologically oriented plant physiologists have fallen down on the job that it wasn't until about 7 or 8 years ago that people started speculating that this was a major driver of global productivity, this direct effect of vapor pressure deficit. So I used boreal forests as an example of climate change effects. Could have picked tropical savannas or agricultural systems, And you see the same thing almost everywhere, that climate change is generally having negative consequences. At the same time, we're simplifying our ecosystems through direct land management or mismanagement and disturbance. And what are the consequences, scale of that? Well, our experiments with diversity, you could try to extrapolate from them, but instead, I teamed up with Jingjing Liang and Tom Crowther and a bunch of others to bring forest inventory data together from more than 80 countries around the world. And we could use that to look at the relationship between biodiversity and productivity. And we see virtually the same shape of a productivity species richness relationship within each of the forest areas of the world as we see in our experiments, meaning that in any particular forest region, the plots that have higher richness tend to have higher productivity, and as you go to nearby plots that have lower richness, productivity falls off. So this notion that biodiversity matters to ecosystem function seems to really hold true in observational systems globally, and it's actually true in observational systems in grasslands as well. And this matters not just for the biomass accumulation in the plants, but also for forest soil. It's a paper that I teamed up with Xinli Chen, who was then at University of Alberta. He's now back in a professor in China, which we use a different Canadian forest inventory data set that also has soil data. And we looked at that across all the red and orange dots, which the sampling sites were, that forests, these are natural forests that tend to have higher species evenness and functional diversity, were associated with a 30% increase in organic horizon and mineral soil carbon over 10 years. So when they went back over a 10-year period, forests with greater inherent diversity tended to be those that accumulated more soil carbon. So diversity does seem to matter in natural systems as well as in experiments. Now, this gets to now something that I find puzzling, is that despite climate change and biodiversity loss impacts, which should have negative impacts on land carbon sink, the land carbon sink is increasing and has been since 1960. This is data from the Global Carbon Project showing the land sink. Anything above 0 means that in that given year, the land ecosystems have sequestered more carbon or taken more carbon out of the atmosphere than they've given back. And although it's jumped around year to year, in general, it's gone from averaging around 4 or 5 to about 13 or 14 CO2 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. And so what's going on? How do you explain this? Well, a number of people have speculated, by and large, because it's hard to test this other than with models, that this growing land carbon sink is attributed to elevated CO2, especially in the tropics, and to climate warming in high latitudes where longer growing seasons might be increasing productivity. Well, I already showed you data from the only tropical CO2 experiment showing that there's no response there, and also showed you data from Canada showing there's no indication that climate warming is increasing productivity there. So how do we reconcile this? And I don't actually have the answer. I do want to point out, though, that there is evidence that CO2 does have positive effects on carbon storage on average. This is another paper led by César Terrer, where we took data from 108 experiments, and we saw that in almost all of them, you had either increased soil carbon accumulation or plant biomass carbon accumulation under elevated CO2. And this just shows that systems tended to do one or the other. And I put the red dotted line in, which actually we probably should have put in the paper. So anything to the right of that red dotted line is a system where you're actually accumulating more carbon in plants and soil in aggregate than you are. And almost every system is doing that. So there is evidence from experiments, many different experiments, that higher CO2 is leading to higher carbon storage. It's probably part of what's happening globally, but my hunch is there's other things going on that we don't understand. And that's pretty worrisome because some people are predicting that this land carbon sink is not going to continue going up, but is going to start going down. Oh, and I should point out here that because Uke Face is the only tropical forest, this figure is almost all temperate grasslands and young forests. So there's lots of parts of the world which aren't included in this graph. So getting back to this trajectory over time of the land carbon sink, and I added 2 dots here for the 2 most recent years. This is the year of those big Canadian fires, and that's why that's depressed compared to other years. But this land carbon sink, this bar arrow here, is actually a pretty big chunk of the red arrow, which is the magnitude of carbon emissions, including from deforestation. So, if we can move this arrow up a little bit, that may be taking out a meaningful chunk of the CO2 we're putting in the atmosphere. So that's the whole reason that this whole notion of natural climate solution involving carbon sequestration exists and has any validity at all. And so people have come up with dozens of ways in which this can happen. I've borrowed 6 pictures from Project Drawdown. There's 20 or 30, so I'm only showing a subset. Things such as additional avoided conversion, meaning leaving carbon in peatlands and forests and grasslands around the world, including protecting grasslands, restoring tropical forests, conservation agriculture of many different kinds, tree intercropping, tree plantations and degraded land. And even though tree plantations get a bad rap, often for good reasons, they can be useful as well. So, we have a variety of ways you can think about this. Now, it's easy to take a nice photo and put a picture up there and say this is going to help sequester more carbon. Does it really? How do you do this? How do you test it? Those are challenges that we still face. And I'm going to talk about one of them here, which is simply is there enough capacity on land to acquire more carbon and store it? Isn't all the land already used for agriculture in cities and existing forests? That's a common question. So actually, and as I wander around the landscape, when I'm traveling, I like to visit forests like this that actually have a lot of carbon in them. And the middle picture there is actually from Tasmania again last month. But as I emit carbon and create environmental sins by driving to these places, this is what most of the forests look like when you go there. They're scrubby, they're thin, they've got diseases, they've got various problems. So the question is there enough capacity in existing forests around the world if they were more densely stocked and had a longer age rotation? Not talking about making every forest in the world old growth, but just shifting that distribution of forest ages to a longer rotation age to store meaningfully more carbon. So we used the Global Forest Biodiversity Initiative and some ground and some remote sensing data a couple of years ago now, and came up with this estimate that there's 200 to 250 petagrams of carbon unused potential in forests outside of cities and agricultural lands. So it's not like we're taking land from agriculture or cities, and that this potential is driven by diversity. And there are several other groups that did analysis at the same time that actually came up with more optimistic numbers than this. Now, if you're like me, petagram is so big, I have no framework for even thinking, what does this mean? So if I convert it to something I can think about, if by 2075, we achieved a third of that, which would still be a major accomplishment, that would cut additional climate change by 1/6. It's not a silver bullet, it's not going to solve climate change, but maybe we can manage our landscapes to help slow climate change by doing things such as having healthier, more diverse forests, which also store more carbon. Like I said, there's other people that came up with more optimistic numbers. Here's a paper by Gerard et al. In Nature in 2021, which they did projections that said that by protecting, managing, and restoring intact lands, working lands, and native cover in forests, grasslands, wetlands, and more, you could avoid, through avoided emissions and enhanced sinks, they could offset, or we could collectively, theoretically offset 50% of the annual increase in atmospheric carbon. Now, is this going to happen? No, but the fact that there's this much potential means that the notion that we think about carbon on land is a meaningful contributor to climate change mitigation has potential. Because if we did 10% of this or 20%, it's still meaningful alongside with the other things we need to do. So the take-home message from this part of the talk is that natural solutions can help us slow and stop climate change. And this will work because there's strong links between climate ecosystem function and carbon, and traits play a role in that, and that biodiversity matters to ecosystem function. I didn't talk about it today. It's not just a buzzword, and it matters not just to productivity, but also to resilience. And that land-based carbon sequestration can matter for slowing climate change. And in many cases, it actually has co-benefits of very many kinds. So I'm going to segue into the last few minutes to think about climate change mitigation and justice. So even though I said that we could, in theory, store more carbon in forests and have co-benefits, this is I don't know how many of you know Mark Westerby. Only a couple here, but his father was actually a very well-known forest development researcher way back when. This is a quote from 50 years ago now. The contribution of forestry towards improving the lot of the common people in developing nations has been negligible or harmful so far. So this notion that we can use trees and forests to enhance climate change and have co-benefits for local peoples is real, but it doesn't mean we've been doing it the right way over time. And there was a really nice paper by Natalie Seddon in Science 3 years ago that you should read if you haven't, that's talking about mitigation, justice, and biodiversity. She points out that in many schemes to work with indigenous or native people to give them more ownership of their local environment and what happens to it, in theory, to store more carbon, to increase their well-being and to increase biodiversity, that in many cases, a lot can go wrong. And I won't go into all the reasons why these can become lose-lose-lose situations, but she gives a number of examples. But she also points out that not everything always goes wrong. So just because we do a bad job of trying to have natural climate solutions, not just for climate, natural solutions, not just for climate, but for biodiversity and for social justice, doesn't mean that there aren't cases where we haven't gotten it right. And she gives examples of these as well. And so I think we need to keep that in mind, that we can do it wrong, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't think about doing it. Now, I've spent almost the entire time here talking about this number 4 here, which is what on land we do and how that has impacts on sequestering emissions or not. But as I mentioned, that's at best going to be a partial solution to slowing or stopping climate change, and that to actually decarbonize, we need to combine that with decarbonizing electricity, electrifying everything, and increasing efficiency. So the real question is, can we combine these solutions? You know, we tend to think about, the people think about transport systems, don't think about solar panels, and they don't think about forests or grasslands, but all of those need to happen simultaneously. So I started thinking about this a few years ago and wanted to think about the way in which there were links between all these different aspects of decarbonization and economics and governance inequality. And we actually have a paper coming out next week in the PNAS about this. And the 2 points I want to make here is that, not surprisingly, emissions are higher per capita in richer countries. This is per capita emissions, and this is per capita GDP. And that, also not surprisingly, the damages shown in the bottom right here, the future percent loss of GDP, is really, really high in countries with low per capita GDP. It's actually still pretty high even in the richer countries. And so this is injustice because those who are polluting, meaning people in Australia and US, Canada, and Europe, are going to have the least negative consequences of climate change. And actually within every single country on Earth, the poorer people, including places like Australia and the US and Canada, but also all the poorer countries of the world, the poorer people within countries also have far more vulnerability to these impacts. And so we have all this injustice baked into our system. Is there anything we can do about it? And here I'm going to move us back a step to think about this within the respective, whether it's fair to ask poor countries to decarbonize. And this is kind of a trade-off at national scale involving development versus the environment. And people have been asking this for quite a while, with the notion that we got rich, Australia, US, Europe, by polluting, by putting carbon in the air. Is it fair to ask poor countries not to do that, because it'll slow down their increasing the well-being of their people? Well, this question implies that the path to well-being and prosperity requires inefficient and expensive emissions. How many of you heard of the Kuznets hypothesis? No, it's basically the hypothesis in economics that asks this very question about whether there's a very predictable trajectory. And the answer is no, actually, that when there's dozens and dozens of economic studies that look at whether or not investing in renewables has negative impacts on economic development in countries, and the answer is there's no evidence for that. And it makes sense, actually, if investing in solar costs less than buying fossil fuels from some other country, it makes no sense that you would actually have a poor economy. Now, again, Jack Westerby pointed out in the same paper 50 years ago that it's probably wrong to assume that countries in the early stages of development must necessarily follow the same path we have when we're at that stage of development, but it's still baked into the economics and the development literature. And so actually in this paper, we found 13 countries in developing this paper, low to medium income countries, places like the Czech Republic and Cuba and Ecuador, Estonia, Latvia, et cetera, where they actually, rather than having increase in greenhouse gas emissions, which is what most of the poorest countries of the world have been showing for the last 30 years, they tend to have slightly decrease in emissions, not fast enough to meet their commitments to slow climate change, but at least they're going in the right direction. And they've done it at the same time that their reliance on solar and wind energy has increased, that their economic well-being has increased, and the internal economic injustice in the country has decreased. So I'm not suggesting that these are causal, but there's certainly no evidence that these countries that have reduced their emissions are doing so at a cost to their economy or their well-being. So this notion that we should wait and allow all the developing countries to finish developing before they slow down their carbon emissions actually doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense for them, even because they're the countries that are going to face the biggest consequences of climate change if we don't stop climate change soon. So the last couple of slides would suggest that I think it's a moral issue as well as an economic one. Let's ignore any of the morality of justice and just look at the dollars. Some people still say it's too expensive to do anything about climate change, as if this old notion that it's the economy versus the environment still holds. Whereas in fact, and this is not, again, my numbers, this is numbers from economists and major corporations, it's actually too expensive not to stop climate change. It would cost less than 2% of GDP per year over about a 20 or 30-year period to stop climate change completely. Whereas the damages from climate change are going to be at least 5 to 10% over the 30 years. And they're going to continue to get larger and larger. And actually, once you stop climate change, it's not going to cost anymore. So there's like absolutely no economic incentive not to stop climate change. And in fact, it's going to be required. And this is actually why, in the beginning, you pointed out, I'm actually optimistic. It's not that human beings do the right things for the right reason, but that greed is a very powerful motivator. And sooner or later, the businesses of the world, maybe before the governments, are going to realize that, you can't just chase the bottom line for the next quarter. At some point, you're going to have to start looking out 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years. Insurance companies already do this. Other corporations are going to start to do it. And I think that these numbers are just going to continue to get more and more divergent over time. And that it's really the inevitable hit that global infrastructure, more than global food production, more than nature, is going to take from climate change that is going to lead to a change. Now, is it going to be fast enough to prevent damages to nature and to the vulnerable people around the world? No. We should have done this 20 years ago. We should be doing it today. If it starts in 20 years, that's a tragedy, but it's better if it starts in 20 years than never happens. So the solutions are all the boring things you've been hearing about for your entire lives if you're less than 40 or 50 years old. Make agriculture green, increase energy efficiency, reduce use, increase renewables, and keep carbon on the land. And whether we actually do this, we can enhance this service, but whether we do it or not really depends on global politics and global society. And hopefully my country is not an example of where we're going over a multi-decadal scale. Hopefully it's just a hiccup in the road to doing the right thing for both the right and wrong reasons. So thanks for your attention. Wonderful time.
Well, thank you, Peter. That was a fantastic talk, and we're thrilled to have the opportunity to have heard you.
And then you have to leave.
I know that some people have to leave, but if there's no lecture, which doesn't seem to be, there is a lecture. I don't know. Okay, good. So
anyone who wants to hang out and ask a few questions?
We can ask some questions. Yes, go. For the Zoom people.
So it was an interesting list of countries that are in that mid to low income and not have low emissions for their development for development. But did you look at some of the characteristics of those countries? I know many of them were in Europe, so very close to trading partners. I mean, did you go into why those countries?
That's great. That's one of the next things on our agenda, is to try to look at the characteristics, the traits of the different countries around the world and what they're doing for their trying to solve the dilemma of maintaining their economy and slowing their carbon emissions. But we didn't do it in this paper at all.
Because I was thinking, like, do they all have carbon markets? Do they all have, regulated?
Yeah.
Like there's lots of policy.
Yes, and so
policy inquisition.
we did briefly talk about the fact that there's 5 or 6 different main ways in which this is happening, including carbon markets, including policies, including incentives, and that generally those are taken up by most of these countries more than the countries that are not doing this. So.
Thanks for a great talk. I've got a question. Like, we always hear in the media and in the public about the tipping points of ecosystem function, and we reach the tipping points and we're beyond the tipping points. But based on your talk, there's hope, at least. So how much hope is there, and when do we reach a tipping point where we cannot turn around anymore?
That's a great question. I'm actually not a big fan of the whole tipping point analogies that are at the global scale. The underlying, because nature is more resilient than perhaps we think it is. And so I may be wrong, and maybe those predictions of these tipping points are right, but I'm not convinced that they are. And so that's a big unknown, of course. And I think the same thing holds when you think about tipping points in governance. I mean, right now in my country, that's a huge unknown, whether we have already passed the tipping point or soon will. So that's a really good question. I don't really have the answer, but I guess I'm not as pessimistic. And I think that most of those tipping point analogies aren't very robust from a scientific perspective. They're conjectures that have gotten a lot of attention, both within the scientific world and outside. And they may be true, but I don't think we have enough. And if you go back and read those papers, there's very, very little data that I would view as reliable about whether or not those projections are true. People might disagree with me, but that's my perspective. So.
Thanks. That was a really terrific talk. So I was just curious, and I understand that, you're a terrestrial ecologist and that's your perspective, but, most of the planet is covered by deep open water. Is there anything about pelagic marine ecosystems that you think cannot contribute to being more of a carbon sink, or is that just an area for future exploration?
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to give the impression that the oceans couldn't also be a major player, and they have been historically. I forgot to mention today, because I don't know anything, I don't study the oceans, so I focused on land. So there's probably just as many dimensions of how oceans can contribute either to storing more carbon or storing less carbon, depending on what we do to them, both through direct management, but also through climate change. And if you have a short answer to that, that'd be great. Oh.
Thank you. Yeah, that was super interesting. I have a slightly more theoretical question, I guess, in terms of the way we do science. So much of the stuff that you presented was incredible, but it was also multi-decade studies. And at the moment, we're kind of facing a ARC grant review where lots of our grants are going to be like 2 years. What's your perspective on like the future of science and academia and the value of long-term research versus the like ease and capacity for those projects to actually get up over the next 50 years?
That's a great question. I think that by default, around the world, we've developed a system where grad students and postdocs do 99% of the research in the world. There are, national labs in various countries that where long-term scientists do longer projects. But because the length of a PhD or a postdoc is 2 or 3 years, 99% of what we do are questions that a single person can address in 2 or 3 years. And there's a great many fantastic things you can do, but there are also questions that take 10 people 10 years to answer. And we actually have surprisingly few ways of making that happen. And most of our grant agencies, just like corporations, are more and more myopic time-wise, like, oh, you have to have transformational research that's, it's not just incremental, and within a year, you have to show how that's changing the industry. It's like this, it's true in Australia, it's true in this, it's like, get real, it's like, and so I think that the misunderstanding by even well, maybe it's not a misunderstanding, maybe it's the political pressure they're under, the funding agencies trying to force us to like solve the world's problems with short-term research, is a big challenge. Now, scientists are clever and opportunistic, and things such as big data and the fact that data is becoming more and more available globally will allow people to start to do things like patch together data over 30 or 40 years about corn yields and disease in Brazil, let's say, where you don't have a long-term study, but you can somehow find the data to address long-term questions. Now, it doesn't mean you can address every question, because some do require upfront organization. But I think that we will start to take, I know already people are a longer-term view, but I don't think we're going to make new long-term experiments, because almost no country that I know of is investing in those kind of studies. And I think from an ecology standpoint, particularly, that's a major issue and problem. Because in our experiments, and one reason we've kept them going is we would find something over 3 years, and that seemed like 90% of experiments only last 3 years, or 99%. But then over the next 10 years, we'd see something different that we hadn't expected at all, or even that doesn't fit with theory even. And then it's like, well, you need a 10-year experiment. But then the next 10 years, it changes again. And so, and there's probably explanations that have to do with long-term plant environment, plant microbe interactions that take a while to play out, that we normally don't ever have the opportunity to study. So one reason I actually spent all the effort to keep the experiments I've been involved in going, because although I love them, would have liked to have time to do other things rather than just trying to find funds for them, is because they're so rare, and I felt like obligated. Like, we spent all this money getting into year 8. Let's try to keep it going to year 11. And if we got it to year 11, why not try to see if we can go a few more years? And so, but I think those are very, very rare. And I don't have a solution for how to change that, because if anything, I think funding for long-term studies is becoming even rarer. Is this a question of mine? Erica asked, on the topic of social justice, I agree that on a long-term perspective, not acting and dealing with climate change is more expensive, and richer countries and large businesses will very likely have the capacity to think in the long term and invest in new approaches. However, I wonder how fair it is to ask family farms and small businesses to make those changes, as it seems the technology is still uncertain in terms of production, and they might not have the capacity to invest in long-term changes, which might even mean changes in current productivity and income. So in essence, smallholders, whether it's in Australia or somewhere else, that's a great question. And I think well, first of all, smallholders are going against the tide, I assume in Australia as well as everywhere else, where large corporations are buying more and more land, and the number of smallholder farmers is becoming rarer because of all the challenges economically and otherwise. So I think that from a social standpoint, governments around the world, and some of them are doing it more than others, can take action to try to level the playing field, because in many cases, actually, the corporations get subsidies indirectly or directly that smallholders don't. And so I'm not an ag economist, but I'm sure you could find one on this campus probably who could lecture you for 8 hours about the intricacies of all these kinds of subsidies and incentives and the like. So I think it's a good question, and one that is challenging when we think of the world at large, because places like China, the vast majority of farmers still are very, very small holders. and same is true in India. So the world is very different in the way in which agriculture happens in different parts of it. So.
Right, thank Peter once again. Thank you so much.